And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Reverend Paul Johnson, who will be speaking to us today on the Corsage of Dr. Martin Luther King.
At the age of 26 in 1955, Martin Luther King Jr. accepted the call to be minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. I've been there and have stood in the pulpit of Martin Luther King Jr. And it's, as I remember, it's a modest-sized congregation, maybe just a bit larger than ours. And I remember when I was there, I was looking all over for the baptistry. Where do they baptize people here? And I couldn't find it. And I've thought since, well, a lot of congregations, use rivers or lakes for baptism, but someday I'll have to find the answer to that question. But it was shortly after we went to that congregation that Rosa Parks made her heroic stand against the bus company in Montgomery. And the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed by the blacks of that community. Essentially, they were saying, we are not going to use your bus system because of this injustice. And 20,000 people began carpooling to avoid the buses. Early on, Martin Luther King was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And theories abound as to why this happened. Some people say, well, Vernon Johns, his predecessor, was very active in social justice issues, so the community naturally turned to him. Some say, well, he had status because he was finishing up a doctorate in social ethics at the Boston University. But he was working on a thesis comparing and contrasting two theologians, Henry Nelson Wyman, who was a Unitarian, by the way, and the theologian Paul Tillich, who was Lutheran. Some say it was because he was a new kid on the block, and he wasn't identified with any of the various factions in town. But anyway, he took the position on, and right away it got tough. There were threatening phone calls all times during the day. He was arrested and jailed for a time on a minor traffic infraction. And there were many, many differences of opinion within the black community. And so he began to think of ways that he could gracefully resign without being thought a coward. And one evening at his kitchen table, he was praying about this issue, about how he could gracefully resign. And a voice deep within him said to him, go forward despite your fears and all of the confusion. That was an experience of the divine that was more definite and profound than he had ever experienced before. And he followed that voice for the next 14 years, despite fears. A short time after that, his house was bombed. And he was off speaking at Montgomery Improvement Association meeting. And when he heard of it, he ran home as fast as possible. And a good portion of the front portion of his house was destroyed. But his wife and 10-week-old daughter were towards the rear of the home, and they were not hurt. Well, there were several hundred people there vowing vengeance and off with guns for retaliatory strike, but he was true to his nonviolent principles and said absolutely not. And both parents came, Corrida's father and Martin's father. They came to Montgomery and said, you've got to leave here. You can't stay here. You're going to be killed. And Daddy King said, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. But they stayed. The whole family stayed. And a short time later, his house was bombed again. And then, of course, the boycott was ended by order of the Supreme Court. It had lasted 385 days. So for 14 years, he challenged his fears again and again. In Harlem in 1958, he was signing his books when a woman came up and plunged a letter opener into his chest barely missing his aorta, and there was an operation of several hours as surgeons tried to take that out without piercing his aorta, and his life was saved. A short time later, he was at a Southern Christian Leadership conference in Birmingham on the podium, and a man came up, a member of the American Nazi Party, and began to pummel him, and he kept his hands to his side as others wrestled the man to the floor. It was later found he also had a gun on his person. I was living in Chicago in the early to mid-'60s, going to college, and I was impressed when he came. He led marches in Gage Park, just virulent anti-black area. And, stones and rocks were hurled, and one hit him in the head and knocked him to the ground, and, of course, that could have been fatal. And we know how he marched against Bill Connors down in Birmingham, and how he was arrested. And I read not too long ago that Billy Graham paid his fine. I thought that's interesting. But he led the march from Selma to Montgomery, where in that desolate area, a sniper could have easily picked him off as he led that march. I'm pleased, I'm proud that 1/4 of all Unitarian Universalist ministers in the country accompanied him on that march. And the president of our denomination, Dana McLean Greeley, was right up in the front with him. So again and again, he was a man of courage, willing to put his life on the line literally hundreds of times. And of course, we know that his life was finally taken on April 4th, 1968, when he was in Memphis to support the striking garbage workers. But more than anyone else, he's responsible for the civil rights revolution in our country. I believe that Martin Luther King Jr. meets Aristotle's definition of courage very well. Courage involves someone having a noble goal and then the ability to challenge this fear and meeting that goal, moderating that fear when appropriate. And of course, Aristotle had this Nicomachean ethics named after his son, that every virtue lies between two extremes. In terms of courage, on the one end you have cowardice, on the other hand you have brash foolishness. And some would argue, well, he didn't stay in the middle of Aristotle's thought there. He was very brash when it comes to life and limb. But I read a number of years ago Ralph Abernathy's autobiography, his close associate. And Aristotle said the courageous person does not obliterate fear, but operates despite fear. And Abernathy tells us that before major confrontations, King became violently ill. Now, not just an upset stomach, but sweating profusely. He said it reminded him of that biblical account of Jesus sweating, as it were, drops of blood at Golgotha, or at Gethsemane before he was arrested. So he would go just agonies of soul, of fear and terror when he was about to embark on one of these marches or times when he was going to be at risk. And he would tell his associates about how someday he would retire to a farm in Georgia and leave this dangerous struggle behind. But of course, that inner voice kept urging him on. Now, what is it about his legacy as we remember him on this Martin Luther King Sunday that remains to challenge us? And of course, the question comes, what would I be willing to die for in terms of the rights of others? What would I jeopardize my life for? Have you ever asked yourself that question? I've asked myself, and of course I'm relatively certain I would risk my life for my family, But how about in terms of anyone else? I know one thing. If my 10-week-old child was threatened by a bombing, I would get that child out of town. But he didn't. And of course, and I don't know exactly how there was one situation where I remembered him in making a decision. I was working at interim director of our denomination's Washington office in 1975. And our denomination was part of the National Coalition to Ban Handguns. And we had planned, first of all, a news conference where people were going to come and talk about loved ones who were killed by handgun violence. And then we were going to have a march all around Capitol Hill, on those streets around Capitol Hill, and then circle around and come back and be addressed by some members of Congress. And I had worked very diligently to get a lot of UUs to come to that march, and from all the churches around Washington, D.C. And so Jack Corbett, the president of the organization, said to me, "Paul, you've worked so hard in this, and there's going to be so many UUs there that I want you to carry the banner and lead the march." I said, "Oh my God, there's so many gun nuts out there. I'm going to be at the front of this whole march." But I didn't want to appear cowardly, and so I did it. But of course, no one had actually said, "If you do that, we're going to kill you." I did have some calls to my office, even from UUs who were against that march. But I did it. But of course, it wasn't the same as what Martin Luther King faced again and again. But how about short of our life on the line, just standing up for common human dignity when it might not be popular? Fred Craddock, who died about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, to me was America's premier preacher. He was professor of preaching at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. I heard him give a sermon one time, a very moving sermon. He said that when he was studying for his doctoral prelims at Vanderbilt University, he would go late at night to a Greasy Spoon restaurant and get a cup of coffee and a toasted cheese sandwich to fortify him in his studies. And one night he did this, and he was through his toasted cheese sandwich on a second cup of coffee before finally the waiter waited on an elderly black man who had waited this whole time for a hamburger. And an old hamburger from the back of the grill was given to him, and he couldn't even eat it there. He had to go off, and he had to sit on the curb outside. And Craddock said the detritus from passing 18-wheelers provided the condiments for his hamburger. And as he left that restaurant that night, he felt so guilty. And he said he heard a cock crow 3 times. And that motivated him to be more courageous in the future, to challenge that type of behavior. And I thought of this in reference to myself, where I was really a coward one time. In my first congregation, my congregation had a community building in town that had been built many years before that for community events, and it was owned by our church. And one night, a local policeman called and said, it was like 1 in the morning or something. He said, "Someone neglected to lock the door. Will you come and lock the front door?" So I got up and went and locked the front door. And while I was there, locking the door, a group of young men, they looked like teenagers, drove up. And this policeman gave them holy hell. He swore at them. He called them terrible names. Apparently he had some bone to pick with them. And I was just aghast. Because this policeman was, boy, he was the picture of courtesy with me. And he had given me a break one time when he saw that I didn't have my tag up to date. You know, I had procrastinated putting at my license plate, and he just gave me a warning rather than a ticket, and was always very cordial to me, and had called me to lock the door. And I just did not confront him about this terrible behavior of these young people. And that's always bothered me. I had a church member who was on the city council. I could have raised it with him. But to challenge a policeman takes an act of courage, doesn't it? And there could have been many ways I could have done that, but I let that opportunity pass. Now, I think of that from time to time and how I would change that behavior to be more courageous. And of course, the other thing often, we're involved in conversations with people where ethnic jokes are told. Or I remember one time I was with a group of people and they started telling jokes and making derisive comments about gay and lesbians. And one of my brothers, Phil, who's now passed away, was gay. And it was very hurtful to hear these. And I finally said, I'm going to say something. And I said, what you're saying was certainly not true of my brother, who was gay. And it kind of, stopped that derisive conversation. But how many times are we willing even to take a step of courage like that? And then, of course, in general, life so often is lived in quiet desperation of people because of fears that they have. Fears of flying. I had one parishioner one time who just couldn't stand to go on an airplane. She was so fearful. And her husband had won through his employment several trips, wonderful trips to foreign countries and around the world. But they couldn't go because of her fear. So she came and asked me, what should I do? And she said, whenever I get on that airplane and that door closes, I'm overcome by claustrophobic feelings. I got to get out of there. I can't stand it. Well, I suffer from claustrophobia, and she was making me fearful. So I referred her to a behavioristic psychologist to work on systematic desensitization, which has helped with so many people. Or I think of Janet, a member of a congregation who was very shy, and we had a fellowship group that put out the newsletter every week, and she would even be shy about talking with this group or expressing her opinion. And one time she said to me, Paul, I've got to do something about this. I just, whenever I just can't even imagine myself speaking before a group. And so she said, I'm thinking of joining Toastmasters. And I said, Janet, that's a terrific idea. And I encouraged her to do that. And then I remember it came up to the day for her first talk. And she just, I can't imagine doing this. So she went to her doctor, who gave her a prescription for beta blockers. And she was able to get up, and her heart wasn't pounding that hard. And she actually joined Toastmasters and was able to work on that fear. I have a fear of elevators. That goes back to 2 times in my childhood when I was trapped, one time by neighborhood kids who had made a pit, dug out a pit, and put me in it, and then put stuff on top so I couldn't get out. And there I was, crying for help for a long period of time. And another time I was caught in another situation where I was crammed in with others and couldn't get out. And so I've always had this feeling of claustrophobia. And, but, for many years, I walked up a lot of stairs because of my fear. My wife, Carol, will attest to that. And it takes a real challenge to ask what's the worst that could happen. Well, the worst that could happen, of course, is that you push that buzzer and someone eventually will come to rescue you, right? And it is not a life-threatening situation. So often I screw up my courage enough to go on the elevator without a problem. But then a number of years ago at General Assembly, when it was in Fort Worth, I was in a freight elevator on a very hot night crammed with people, and we got stuck for over 45 minutes, and I was in the back of that elevator. What was I going to do? I was having this panic attack, but I just waited it out. I was the last one off the elevator when the firemen came, and we were between floors, and they kept saying, you got to be very careful, because when the weight shifts on the elevator, it might shift, and it might cut you in half. And I was the last one to leave. Another minister back in the back with me says, is it parishioners first before clergy? I said, well, we don't have a choice. We're in the back. But we finally made it out. And you know, that actually helped me, because I was able to survive by concentrating on my breathing and thinking about something else. Because another time too, you know, to ask the question, what's the worst that can happen, and is my fear justified? When I was after my third year of college, I took a job as a night man in a funeral home. And my friend who got me the job, and I wanted that job because I was going to go to summer school to take extra courses so that I could graduate early and go on to seminary early in my evangelical days. And but that first night in the funeral home, we had bodies and euphemistically designated slumber rooms on each side of the room in which we were sleeping. I woke up in the middle of the night, and I didn't know what it was called at the time, but a panic attack, where I, hyperventilated, didn't get any sleep. And the next night that my friend was with me that night, I was going to have to come back the next night and be alone. How am I going to do this? And then often the police brought in a body. And that, I tell you that story a different time. That was when that first happened to me. But so that whole day, the next day, I went to the library and read about fear. And I came to the conclusion that being in that funeral home was about the safest place for me to be in the city of Chicago that night. And I kept telling myself that. And you know, I slept through the whole night and was able to keep that job and finish my summer school course for the rest of the summer by challenging the fear. I was glad when the summer was over, but that was very, very helpful. But what Martin Luther King encourages us to do is to quote, as he phrased it, build dikes of courage to hold back the flood of fear. Sometimes fear is helpful and beneficent in helping us at decision making, but many times it isn't. So I hope as a congregation and as individuals we'll follow these words of Goethe, which I've always liked. The moment one definitely commits oneself, the providence moves too. All sorts of things occur to help. A whole stream of events issues from that decision, raising in one's favor all manner of unforeseen incidents and meanings and assistance. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Amen. So may it be on this Martin Luther King Sunday.